Good morning, everybody. First off, apologies. I wanted to get this up this weekend, but life is busy and complicated. So, today we're going to talk about resurrection. I'm going to talk about it from a couple of angles, but primarily from the angle of personal identity. That's the basic philosophical question people ask most often about resurrection. First thing you should do is look up some references on it. We talked about this last time, actually. I would like you to go look again at Luke 24. It's near the very end of the Gospel of Luke, and it's the clearest biblical reference to what resurrection is supposed to be like. Jesus has died and has risen from the dead and reappears to his disciples. And certain things get emphasized in that chapter. His physical nature gets emphasized. He eats food. His body is present. There's another passage, the famous Doubting Thomas passage, where Thomas doesn't believe that it's Jesus who has risen from the dead, and Jesus' reassurance takes the form of asking him to touch his body. So, resurrection is in some sense bodily, but what does that mean is the basic question we have to ask today about resurrection. So the Gospels give you one picture, and I'd argue that it's essentially physical, but what that means is, the question. Then there's a passage from Paul, written much later. Paul never met Jesus. He was a generation later. He, in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, gives you an analysis of it that clearly he was thinking about the same questions we are. What is this supposed to be? Is it physical? Is it non-physical? Physical things, will they just die again? And gives you a metaphor of a seed and a plant. The seed and the plant are not one thing, but they are parts of one thing through time. That is supposed to be, intended to help solve this question of what resurrection is. And he argues that your new body, so it will still be a body, will be made of a new substance that is breathly. Your translation may call it spiritual, but they didn't, as far as we can tell, didn't have a concept of spiritual, so the word they used was pneumatic. Soma, body, pneumaticon, breathly. Like pneumonia. Soma pneumaticon means your body is going to be made of something like breath, which I think is him just reaching with his language towards something. You tell me what. But that's the Pauline picture of resurrection is something like breathly spiritual. The gospel picture from Jesus is something like physical. And they seem to be in tension with each other. Maybe they're not. Maybe you can put those two things together. Part two, though, that's the textual question. Now, oppose that again to what we talked about last week. Plato, 400 years earlier, thinks your body is not you. Your body is a prison. You should hope to someday be released from the chains of the body, and your soul can go off to freedom in a heaven of souls. And that's an influential, dominantly influential picture of the afterlife in Western culture. The two pictures have coexisted for so long that for more than 1,000 years now, I'd say 1,600 years now, roughly, since, say, the 4th century BC, they've gotten smushed together so that people believe they mean the same thing. And that's kind of the point of these two classes today, is to help us disentangle their histories and remember that they came from different places and they actually say opposite things. You are not your body, in Plato's picture, and you are your body, and your body will rise again in the Christian resurrection picture. Okay? So, what does it mean for your body to rise again, or for you to exist again in this resurrection story? That's the question of personal identity. Now, personal identity is a problem quite apart from the afterlife, but the afterlife makes it vivid. Okay, so the personal identity story is really just an example of the universally tricky question of identity through time. Generally, you take any object, a ship, and consider it changing through time. You change this piece, you change that piece, you change a sail, you change a mast. You know, you take a car, you change the tires. And you realize that as it goes through these changes, it's not the same thing. Same, strictly speaking, means identical. Two things are identical, but all their parts line up. If one of their parts doesn't line up anymore, we are no longer talking about the same thing. It may be mostly the same, but it's no longer exactly the same if it changed. So the basic question of identity is, how much change and which changes can a thing go through while you're still justified in calling it the same thing? You know, you like change the tires on your car, you didn't get a new car, but certain changes, you change enough pieces and now it's made of all new parts. You have a new thing. When did it become new? Personal identity is just that question applied to persons through time. People change, and they change more dramatically, I think it's fair to say, than many other objects in the world. It's like, this glass isn't going to change much. It's just a glass. You and I have minds that are constantly flowing. Thought disappears, new thought comes in, thought disappears, new thought comes in, emotions come and go through us. We're constantly changing. Our bodies are constantly changing too. We and all animals grow from this small to this large size, and then we fall off into old age, and our bodies are constantly physically being made of new stuff and changing our form. So how much change can we justify while still calling ourselves the same person? When what sense are we the same? When we're 42 versus when we were 22 or 16 or 2? I'm very different than the 2-year-old me. I don't remember him at all. He had no vision of me. We call ourselves the same person, but is that just a mistake? It is a central doctrine in Buddhism that there is no identity through time. It's the doctrine of anatta. Anatta says that there is no self, in the sense that there's no one you that survives all the changes through your life. The you today and the you tomorrow go through subtle changes, and changes change. If you've changed, you are not the same thing. And trying to find some oneness through that, it's one me through time, is a mistake, I think the Buddhists. Resurrection is a promise that the you who's hearing this will be the same you who rises from the dead later. That is an identity claim, right? You die, you rise from the dead. Now, so we've sort of suggested here that you can go through changes, and some changes are small and don't justify calling you a new thing, and then some changes are very large, and we think, maybe this is not the same thing anymore. Death is a big change. So what kind of preservation, what kind of self on the other side of it would make sense of the idea that that is still you? What's preserved? You're reading from Lynn Baker. It's long, but it's divided into parts in a pretty straightforward, rational way. Let me explain the parts to you and kind of run through them. Her object is to try to give you different pictures of identity. She gives you four famous old pictures of identity and then concludes with her own fifth one. Okay? So let's run through them. Picture one is, I think, strictly not a picture of resurrection. It's a picture of sameness in the afterlife, but it's the soul picture that we've already talked about with Plato. Some criticisms she raises of that picture are, one, what kind of world would that be if you arise to find yourself in an afterlife in a world that is not physical? Are you in a dream? Are you in a, is there space? Is there time if there is no body? As far as identity goes, there's one deep question I think she raises about this that has really gone back to at least John Locke and probably older than that. If you are your soul, and your soul is supposed to preserve your personal identity, I am still myself after death because I have the same soul. What does same soul mean? How do we know your soul doesn't change? We know your body changes. We know your mind changes. And your mind is the closest, tangible thing we have to try to think of the soul. Your soul is the seat of the mind or something. It's what thinks. It's what is awake and conscious in you. That's your soul. It's the seat of the thoughts and the emotions. But your thoughts and emotions change. So if your soul is supposed to be the thing that guarantees identity, how do we know that it doesn't change with the things it holds? If it's just your thoughts and emotions, or the thing that possesses them, and they're constantly flowing, it presumably is too. So how do we know your soul doesn't change? Souls are one picture. Picture one. Picture two, she calls the soul-body composite, that you are a soul and body together. Now, soul here has to be deflated a little bit from the Plato picture. The name we attach to this soul-body composite story is Aristotle. Aristotle believed in hylomorphism. Let me spell that in case you want to actually look it up, because it's worth a little research. Hylo is Hylo. It's the Greek word for wood. Morphism, Morphism. Hylomorphism is a general metaphysical picture in which you are a combination of two things: substance, the stuff you're made of, and form, the shape it's shaped into. And the idea is that neither of these concepts, substance or form, is strong enough to exist on its own. There is no such thing as some substance that has no shape. And there is no such thing in our world as a shape that's got no substance, like ghostly shapes walking around, not made of anything. If you are a thing, you are made of some stuff in a certain form. And everything is essentially that combination. You are a combination of the matter you're made of, but that matter could fall apart, it could scatter to the wind, or it could be put together like you. Unless it's put together like you, it is not you. So what does soul have to do with it? You are a body in a certain shape. Soul, I think, on this picture is sort of a misnomer. What he meant by soul is your form, but not just your form. It's the form that gives you life. It's a biological notion, really, for him. It's when a body is alive. In De Anima and On the Soul, Aristotle's picture of the soul-body composite is, there's a metaphor he gives. The soul is to the body as vision is to an eye. So an eye is not vision, and vision is not an eye. They're two different things. But you can't see without an eye. And an eye doesn't see unless it takes exactly the right form. It's a functional notion. It's what an eye does when it's alive. So what is your soul? It's what your body does when it's alive. So you have a body, someday it dies. If that death can be brought back to life, if you can make it move, make it work again, if you can Frankenstein it back to life, then it has a soul again. Soul is motion in a certain way, motion and proper functioning when it works right. This is a picture of resurrection. At least it lends itself to a picture of resurrection. You are not just a body, you are a body that works a certain way, and resurrection is what happens if your body works again. God could reanimate you, and if he reanimates that body, that's one way of conceiving of resurrection. Lynn Rutter Baker's picture of her problem with this is in making sense of what souls have to do with it or bodies have to do with it. It seems as though you don't really need either one. Your body doesn't have to have a soul to be this body, and this soul doesn't have to be attached to that body to be that soul. Couldn't we reanimate you with different stuff? Couldn't you use a new heart, use a new etc.? So the identity questions there are attached to what's really essential. What has to be there? It's not clear that the parts you have now have to be there in the future. In fact, they're not there in the future in this life. You're going to be made of new parts in the future in this life. Every time you go through a year of change, your body's made of new stuff. Every time you eat new food and burn off new old calories, you're changing physically. So what's same about it is her question. The third picture ignores the soul completely, as if it were a notion from a different religion or something, and says you are this body, and to survive you have to be this body again. There's a passage, let me see if I can find it. Where's it go? On page 698, where she talks about sameness of body and raises the classic question of it, the Van Inwagen question. Let me give you this picture. Let me just tell you the story. Peter Van Inwagen gives you an analogy. You are in a monastery in, say, the 6th century AD. The monastery burns to the ground, and in it is a book written by St. Augustine, and it burns, ashes. God comes down and puts those ashes back together and hands it to you. You survive the fire, and he hands the book back to you and says, here, I put it back together. You still have the original manuscript from St. Augustine. And you're like, yay, the book was preserved. Now, here's the question. The question is not whether God could do that. God is omnipotent. He can put things back together. The question is, if he puts it back together, is it the same one Augustine wrote? Is it the original? He chose the word manuscript in this story on purpose, because a manuscript is something you write with your own hand. Manuscript. Manuscript. So, if Augustine wrote it, it's his manuscript. If God puts it back together, it's God's manuscript. If God puts you back together, did you come from the same place as you did in your life when you were born to your mom and raised by your dad and played with your brothers and sisters and went to that school? Do you come from the same place? And does it matter? Maybe not, but maybe unless something came from your origin, it's not you. So how could we preserve that? How can we preserve your history in resurrection is the Van Inwagen question. That's a question about same body. Same body to him means came from the same place and then went through the same life. The fourth picture of personal identity is John Locke's memory criterion. John Locke is aware of the problem of change, and it's driving his question. Your body changes, your mind changes, you think of new things all the time, and those old thoughts disappear. What makes you the same person before and after all those changes is just memory. I remember being 10. I remember being 4. There's a point at which you don't anymore, actually, but let's ignore that for a second. What makes you the same before and after is simply your recollection of your own past. If you remember being the kid who was 10, then that's what makes you and the 10-year-old one person. I remember my past. You don't remember my past. So I am my past and you're not. That's John Locke's picture of identity. Same memory. It's famously good and bad. It gets to the point of why we connect with our own past and not each other's, and why another person can't be you. He doesn't have your history and he doesn't remember it. But memory is also obviously and notoriously faulty. You think you remember things that you weren't there for. You forget most of everything you've ever done. Not a small fraction, but the things that are actually stored in your memory, vanishingly small. Most of what you've done is gone. You could not remember what you had for breakfast 180 days ago to the day today. I'm sure you can, or maybe you can, I don't know. There's also a deeper problem. There's this you remember something you did 5 years ago. 5 years ago, you remembered something you did 5 years before. So now we're 10 years back. You have forgotten the 10-year ago fact. So you and 5 years ago are one if you remember each other. 5 years ago and 10 years ago are one if they remember each other. But you and 10 years ago are not one. How does that work? You are the same person who is the same person, but you're not. A and C are not identical. Memory seems to fall apart as a criterion of identity. It may be a good epistemology of identity. Epistemology meaning it's our way of knowing who we were, but it doesn't make us who we were because we were many things we don't remember. So what now? There's problems with every criterion of personal identity. This is why the Buddhists don't believe in it. Because it's difficult to make sense of. Maybe you're just not the same anymore. Baker's own picture is called a constitution view. And it goes like this. Think of a river. I'll just give you my own analogy of it. Got a river, water flows through it. New waters make up the Mississippi every day. That old water flew out into the ocean. New water flows in from Minnesota. And every day, it's new stuff that makes up this river. But it's the same river, we say. We call it the same name. It's the Mississippi, even though every day you're made up of new parts. That is what you are, she thinks. You're made up of different parts every day, and yet we call you the same. What is the same is your seat of first-person experience. You say, I am Carl, even though the person saying I am Carl is made of different stuff every day. We call that the same river every day. It's got the same name. And essentially, you are just your name. You don't attach to any unique description because that description could flow on and become different every day. So her picture of you is essentially that of the river. You can't step into the same river twice. It flows on and it's made up of new stuff. Tomorrow you're going to be made of new stuff, but we'll still call you you. And if that's right, then after death, if we say you're made of new stuff, we're already used to saying you are made of different things every day. So when you're made of this breathly body of St. Paul or something, made of new stuff altogether, that's just how identity works to her. The difficulties with it are kind of obvious. Like if you can be made of new things, how many new things could you be made of? Could you be made of, truck tires? Could you be made of a football game? Could you be made of light bulbs? No, that's not you. You can go through some changes, but you can't change everything. What has to be preserved? And that's the basic question I want you to answer today on the discussion board. Okay, I'm going to post the questions for it and the reading for it soon. I know I've put this up late, so if you come back if you need till tomorrow to do this, it's fine. I'm not being that much of a stickler in the middle of the coronavirus plague about time. So if you need more time, you can have it. But I'm going to put up the reading and the discussion board and post this video as soon as it loads up. And take the time you need. All right. Hope you guys are having a good day.